Welcome everyone to the third lecture of the Expanding Empathy speaker series. This is hosted at the Rock Ethics Institute through the Moral Agency and Moral Development Initiative that I spearhead. And this is being co-sponsored by the Psychology Department, as well as the Edna Bennett Pierce Prevention Research Center out of HDFS. It's my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Bastian, who is the professor at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. He studies a lot of very fascinating topics, including ethics and well-being. He's investigated a wide array of topics, including why happiness may have a downside, cultural factors related to depression, and why valuing negative and painful experiences in life can be a critical pathway to achieving happiness. He's done a lot of work on motivations that shape ethical decision-making, around issues resolving conflicts of interest, and in particular for today's talk, the treatment of animals and the environment. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles in a lot of the field's top journals, and his work has been covered in the New Yorker, Time Magazine, New Scientist, Harvard Business Review, the Huffington Post. He's received a lot of awards for his research as well, including the Dan Wegner Theoretical Innovation Prize from SPSP, and also Early Career Researcher Awards from Australian Psychological Society, as well as the Society of Australasian Social Psychologists, and a ton of research funding, over $2 million in research funding. So yeah, I was on a symposium with Dr. Bastian many years ago in Amsterdam, and so it's my pleasure to welcome him here to our Penn State community. And so, Brock, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Daryl. Yeah. And hi, everyone. I can't see you, but, much as this last year has been, I'll talk to myself in front of my laptop, yelling into the void, and imagine that you're there. And of course, I think do feel free to throw some questions into the Q&A. And I think Daryl's going to moderate that, and I can respond to those throughout or at the end, either way. So let me share some slides with you, and everyone can see that, I'm assuming. And we'll go back to the start. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is really some research I've been doing for quite some time now. In fact, looking at how people think about animals, and as you'll see towards the end, we're starting to think about how people think about even broader entities in terms of their moral value and their moral standing. But what I'm particularly interested about in I think focusing on animals, and I'll walk through some of the research we're doing there, particularly around what we call the meat paradox, and I suppose the conflict between how we use animals for our own needs, the satisfaction of our own needs, and I suppose how we then, I guess, get around that ethical problem. I think most people experience some ethical conflict around the use of animals in that way, even though most of us don't actually think about it very often. And so, really, I've been very interested in understanding, along with my colleagues, that problem, because I think it's obviously got social importance attached to it, but I think it's also an important domain in which we can really start to understand some of the basic psychological processes that people do engage in. And of course, the models that we've come up with in this work are actually very similar to models that have been developed in business schools around behavioral ethics as well. So we are converging, understanding how people do reason around their ethical considerations and the various motivational biases that play into that. Just as an outline, I'm going to talk to you what is the meat paradox, what do we mean by that, and then how do we resolve it, and what are some of the ways that we might get around that ethical discomfort that people might experience around meat eating, and talk about the role of denying harm by denying mind, and also denying personal responsibility. I'm also going to talk to you. We use a dissonance approach to understanding how people, what's the nature of the conflict that people are trying to experience, how does it come about, and how do they resolve it. And so to talk through one element of a dissonance approach or understanding, which is that people often spread alternatives in response to resolving dissonance. I'll explain this further, but I think this is really important because it helps us to understand that when we are trying to change behaviour in the ethical domain, and including in the domain of meat eating, that we may actually get backfire effects if we're not looking at the ways that people might respond and perhaps even protect themselves in response to some of the messages that we might put out there. So thinking through that, and then also thinking about how sometimes, we might engage in questionable ethical behaviour or things that may have ethical dimensions to them, but often without even thinking. And I suppose thinking how or trying to understand how sometimes some of the I suppose the hard work of resolving the ethical conflict may be outsourced, even to things beyond ourselves and in our societies. And I think that's again instructive in broader ways, but it's certainly evident in the case of what I'm going to focus on, which is around animals and meat eating. And then at the end, I do want to touch on a few broader issues. What are the broader benefits of raising moral awareness of animals and resources more generally? Is it just about protecting their needs, or are there benefits more broadly to other humans, perhaps to the way that we use resources in general? And then also just touch on some current work that we've been doing around the expansion of empathy and moral concern, and perhaps thinking about factors that maybe even go beyond the appreciation of sentience in other entities. And what are some of those factors that might lead people to have moral consideration or concern, or even view something as having moral standing, even when that thing doesn't have any sentience attached to it? So that's the overview of what I want to talk about, and I'll step through that in somewhat of an orderly fashion. So just to go over what the meat paradox. What is it? And it's really not surprisingly the idea that really most people eat meat. A very large majority of people do eat meat. I think there is a bit of a trend in the other direction at the moment, but it's relatively small given the large numbers of people who still do eat meat. And of course, even in India, the world's least meat-eating nation, there's a majority of people who do eat meat. And of course, this is big business. It accounts for large amounts of GDP, and it's also been a source of protein that has been sought out by humans for quite a long time. But the paradox is that most people don't like to reflect on animal suffering. They find it offensive, emotionally disturbing, and therefore potentially disruptive to their meat-eating habits. So I guess the question is, if there is this paradox, this sort of discomfort that people experience, how do they resolve it? Because again, a large number of people continue to eat meat, even though many of those same people do find it uncomfortable to think about animal suffering. And of course, some people will say, well, do animals suffer in the meat production process, or are there more sanitized ways of doing that? And of course, there's I think we can talk about those details, but certainly I don't think it takes very much for people to start to worry about the harm to animals, even in fairly sanitized meat production processes. So here's a model that we've developed to try and understand how people might resolve this. And I'm going to use this as a bit of a guide throughout the talk, just to think through these various factors. So we have, what we might call an immoral action, or at least an action which has a moral dimension to it, which is meat consumption. Again, given that most people are perhaps concerned about the harm at some level that could have, that animals may experience. And this, when people engage in this, there are a number of triggers for dissonance. That is the discomfort that people might experience. Of course, the apparent harm to animals is one trigger, becoming aware that that's the case. If there is some harm and therefore some ethical dimension to this action, then people might feel that their identity is in a way tarnished. People don't like to think of themselves as unethical or engaging in behavior which could have harmful consequences. And so there are identity considerations for people in this too. And of course, if people feel personally responsible, if they have a sense of responsibility for their actions, of course, that's going to trigger more dissonance too. That's going to increase that conflict because it's something that I feel responsible for, that I've chosen to do. And of course, when people experience these dissonance triggers, they might change their behavior. They might decide to stop eating meat. They might think that that's perhaps something that they would choose to do. And of course, if they did do that, then they wouldn't experience any more discomfort. But again, as we know, most people don't choose that option. So what do most people do? And of course, most people find other ways of reducing dissonance then. And that's by denying harm, finding ways to downplay the harm that might be experienced by animals in the meat production process. If we become aware of it, we find ways to downplay it. Perhaps bolstering our identity and finding ways to, I suppose, step aside from any sense that who we are has been tarnished by the behaviour that we've just engaged in, or that we do engage in. And again, finding ways perhaps to deny personal responsibility, that, you know, yes, I do this, but it's not really something that I'm personally responsible for, or it's not a behaviour that I guess is particularly chosen. And these things are all known to, these things should then reduce dissonance. And one of the things one of the outcomes of this process, when people do reduce that dissonance and that discomfort, is that it leads to the spreading of alternatives. And I'll get into exactly what that is and how we think about that later. But broadly, it's the idea that given that we've gone this far and decided to not to change and not to stop eating meat, but rather find ways to I guess make it more palliative that we eat meat, make it a little less uncomfortable, then we might start to think about those who don't eat meat, or even the option of not eating meat as more outside of what really is the range of possibilities for us. And this is what the spreading of alternatives is. The alternative is now, as a result of this process, seen as less attainable, less positive, and like something that really I'd probably be less likely to do as a result of this. And I think this has some implications for how we might intervene, of course, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And of course, this might lead to actually increased behavioural commitment. So once I've gone through that process, I may be now more committed to meat eating than I was even before I went through that process. The other thing here is that, as I said, not every time that people eat a burger do they go through this process, and often there are, I suppose, passive dissonance avoidance mechanisms in place. So this may be the fact that we have habits, and of course, habits lead, behaviours which, are carried out with little conscious reflection. And of course, without conscious reflection, I don't need to focus or think too much about what the ethical implications may be of the behaviour I'm engaging in. There are, of course, social norms which support and normalise this behaviour, and therefore protect people from having to ask those questions as well. And also the ritualisation, institutionalisation of meat and meat production and meat eating, or other ways in which we might, I suppose, step aside and protect ourselves or protect people in general from this experience of discomfort. So I guess the point is that resolving dissonance can actually lead to increased commitment to meat eating, and so we've got to be careful how we push people to resolve that, and also to note that sometimes people may not be doing that at all, and in many cases it may be outsourced onto broader social structures or the broader context. So I'm going to use that as a little bit of a schematic in my talk, but just to go through some research that we've been doing and which speaks to each of those points in that model. And the first is denying harm, and some evidence that people actually do this. And so the argument is that, to resolve the meat paradox, we downplay the mental lives of animals. In this way, if animals don't experience harm, then, they don't have the mental capacity to experience harm, then of course it's less ethically problematic that I might cause some action to them which could be otherwise experienced as harmful. And this makes animals seem less morally relevant. Things that don't experience mental states don't tend to be viewed as morally relevant. And this also reduces our feelings of concern over an animal's welfare. And I suppose the point is we enjoy eating meat, but we don't enjoy or like eating minds. And I think this graph here kind of makes that point. When we asked people to rate the edibility of a number of animals, and then also how much mind they believed those animals had, you can see that there is a clear negative correlation there. Over on the right-hand side are animals like monkeys and dolphins and elephants and gorillas and dogs and horses and things which we tend to see as possessing quite high levels of mind. And on the left and higher up on edibility are things like chickens and cows and sheep and prawns and lobsters and crab. Now, Of course, that doesn't show that people are actually denying mind. And you might say, well, what we've done is we've just chosen to eat the animals that don't have much mind in the first place. But I think it's a much more, motivated and dynamic process than that. And so in other work, we've shown, I suppose, that more motivated aspect to this. So in one study, we provided meat eaters and vegetarians with reminders of animal harm associated with meat production versus giving them no reminder. And so in this case, they looked at this picture of a cow and they were told the cow is just standing in a paddock, chewing grass, or that it's going to be taken to the abattoir and processed for meat production. And then both the meat eaters and vegetarians rated how much the cow could experience a range of mental states, including pleasure, fear, rage, joy, happiness, desiring, wishing, planning, pain, hunger, tasting, seeing, thinking, intending, imagining, reasoning, a whole lot of mental states. And so after being told that either a cow, and this was between subjects, is just standing in a paddock versus it's going to be used for meat production, what were the perceptions that people had of that cow's mind? Well, you can see firstly that vegetarians tend to see cows as having a lot more mind, and I think that's probably the most clear difference in the data we got here. But the other thing about it too is that they weren't sensitive to the manipulation, whereas meat eaters were. When meat eaters thought about the cow as food, as something that was going to be used as food, they actually attributed less mind to the cow compared to when they were thinking of the cow in a context where it wasn't going to be food. For vegetarians who don't eat cows and therefore have no interest in protecting, I guess, their behavior or to stepping away from the ethical implications of their behavior, they weren't sensitive to this manipulation. So I think this shows, at least in the first step, there is some motivated reasoning going on here. And obviously for those who need to engage in that motivated reasoning, which is meat eaters. In another study, we again showed people this picture of a cow and asked them to complete that same mind attribution task. And it was embedded in this case. People were sitting in a room around a table. There was about 8 people sitting around a table, all answering a number of questionnaires. And embedded in that questionnaire package was this mind attribution task and the picture of that cow. I guess we sort of hid that away a little bit. And then we said to people, thank you for doing that part of the study. We now want you to do a different study on consumer behavior. And in this study, we want you to sample some food, and half the table were told they would be sampling. Now, these were all meat eaters. We inconspicuously made sure that we only recruited meat eaters for this study. Half the table were randomly assigned to say they would be sampling some delicatessen beef on a plate, much like the picture there. The other half were told that they would be sampling a green apple. And so we put the bowl of apples and the beef on either end of the table. And again, some people in that room thought they'd be eating the apples, and some people in that room thought they'd be eating the beef. The experimenter then said, look, I'm just going to get some plates and cutlery for you so you can sample the food. Before I go, could you just quickly complete this one more questionnaire? And again, they whipped out the picture of the cow on a piece of paper, and people had to rate how much mind they thought the cow could experience. And they also rated their mood at that point in time. So as you can see here, and again, these are all meat eaters in this study, at time 1, there was little difference across whether people ended up sampling one kind of food or another in terms of their perception of the cow's mind. But at time 2, there was a difference, but only for those people who thought they were about to eat meat. People who thought they're about to eat apples didn't have a motivated need to change their perception of a cow's mind in order to enable or, I guess, engage in unconflicted and untroubled consumption of meat. And so we certainly can see here that really there is quite a motivated process. The other thing that we can see is that to the extent that people did deny mind or downplay the mind of the cow, this also was related to reduced negative affect. And I suppose really this is the key dissonance process, that I change my perception or my attitudes in a way which makes me feel less discomfort, less conflict. And of course, that I think is shown here in terms of reduced negative affect. So we really, I think in this study, managed to capture that dissonance process that we're saying is involved in the meat paradox and how people try and resolve it. We also had a different study where participants were asked to either eat beef jerky or cashew nuts. Again, they were told that they would be sampling this food and they, as a part of a consumer study, and they were to rate various aspects of their enjoyment of it. But also, after eating that food, we then asked them to select animals that they felt moral concern for from a list of 26. So some people had just eaten a bit of beef jerky and had, I suppose, thought about the consumer aspect of that, others a cashew nut. And then they all circled as many of these animals on this list here as they thought, deserved some consideration morally. The thing, what animals that have some moral standing for them. And of course, they could circle all of them. They could circle one, as many as they wanted on this list. We also asked them to rate their moral concern for this cow. Again, the same picture we used in other research. How much moral concern do you feel for this cow, just generally speaking? And what we found here was, whereas in the other study that I showed you before, people changed their perception in preparation for the consumption of meat, here we can see that after consuming meat, people also still change their perceptions. And really, you can see a narrowing of moral concern here. Not only do they circle fewer animals that they felt were deserving of that moral concern, but they also rated the cows having less moral concern as well. So we can really see that engaging in the behaviour changed how people were thinking about animals and about, I suppose, their standing in their own moral worlds. And I think we can sort of see other ways in which sometimes the harm to animals is downplayed. Sometimes we even in the way we advertise meat, make it look as though animals are complicit and happy about the process. And I suppose that's another way that sometimes this perhaps same resolution of this discomfort is achieved. The other aspect that I pointed to before in terms of how people reduce dissonance is by denying responsibility. And so one way, well, there's a number of ways in which we can do this, and there's this great paper by Jared Piazza and colleagues called The Four Ends, where we can see that really the denial of personal responsibility maps onto this idea that, when people believe that meat eating is natural, it's normal, and it's necessary, I need to eat meat for protein, or it's a normal thing for humans to do, or it's natural, it's part of the natural hierarchy of how we engage in our food chain. Again, this really was able to capture a vast majority of, I've just lost my image there. Can everyone still see me okay?
Yes, we can still see you.
Okay, all right, good. For some reason I can't see myself. That's good. All right, so again, this, I suppose here we've got three beliefs that really are about the denial of personal responsibility. And so one of the studies that we did was motivated by this advertising campaign in Australia, which I think maps onto this notion that that meat eating is natural, normal, and necessary. And this was Sam Neill. Some of you might know Sam Neill's the actor. And this was a campaign by the Beef Association in Australia, where he was dancing with an orangutan, and I suppose, well, the fact that orangutans are vegetarian, I think, might have been missed on the advertising agency for this advert. But it showed Sam, a human, kind of acting in a way which was quite animalistic. And of course, other aspects of this campaign were quite explicit in suggesting that humans really, this is a natural state of affairs. If we didn't eat meat, our brains wouldn't be the size they are today. So what's for dinner? Or this one where, ape jumps out of the tree and then many, many years later eats red meat, and then human evolution kind of, begins. So this really is this idea that eating meat is such an important part of I suppose, naturally how we're able to, develop and exist as humans. And so this campaign was highly successful, and Australian expenditure on beef and lamb increased from 8 billion to 9 billion in that year. And so I guess we got a little bit interested in why was this so successful? So we asked in a study for people to write an essay about, in contemporary society, it's clear that animals and humans and animals are actually quite similar in many regards. We'd like you to write a brief essay on how humans and animals are similar. And then the participants completed a measure of moral inclusiveness and also mind attribution in the same ways, using the same measures about, how many animals would you include and how much mind would you attribute. They also, what we asked them to do is to write these essays, humans are animal-like. We coded the essays they wrote naturally. They just wrote the essay the way they would like. And we found that about half of the essays really were written in the framing of humans are animal-like versus animals are human-like. And so when we coded for these and looked at the differences across these essays, and again, people rated the mental states of a cow, and they circled how many animals they felt they wanted to include in their moral world. We found that when people had written about how animals are human-like, they not only rated animals as having greater capacity for sensation, but they also were more morally inclusive in terms of how they saw animals in their moral world, versus when they wrote about how humans are animal-like. So certainly it seems that when we close that divide between humans and animals, the way in which we do it matters in terms of how it's going to play out in the way that we think about animals. So we took this further and asked people experimentally to write an essay about what makes animals similar to humans and what makes humans similar to animals. Again, asking them to explicitly frame their essays in these two different ways. We had a control in this study, which was what makes telephones similar to computers. And again, we asked people to complete the moral inclusivity measure. We also asked them to complete a measure of speciesist attitudes. And this time also moral concern for outgroups. So marginalized groups in a society who may often be viewed as perhaps less than in some way. And so we're interested in whether or not, getting people to write about animals in these two different ways might actually lead to a differential, sense of warmth or concern for even human outgroups that are sometimes, on the boundaries of our consideration. The speciesist attitude measure is here, and just again, three of the items: it's perfectly acceptable for cattle, chickens, and pigs to be raised for human consumption. Animal research cannot be justified, and sometimes I get upset when I see wild animals in cages and zoos. So what we found was that when people, again, consistent with our first study, when people wrote about how animals are human-like, they were more morally inclusive. They had less speciesism compared to when they wrote about humans animal-like. It's interesting that actually writing about how humans are animal-like seemed to be similar to the control condition. So it seems that what is actually kind of pulling the weight here is thinking about animals as more human-like is I guess driving our moral consideration for them. When we think about humans as animal-like, it seems to not be doing too much, and certainly isn't increasing our moral concern for animals. So we can see here, sorry, just to go back, that framing the way that we think about the relationship or the similarity between humans and animals makes a significant difference in terms of how we think about animals morally and our attitudes towards them. Now, I didn't actually put in this slide the attitudes towards human outgroups, but we also found that people were more concerned for those human outgroups when they wrote an essay about how animals are human-like. I guess if you're going to think about animals in that way, then you need to kind of also change how you think about even groups that sometimes might be the targets of prejudice. In terms of the third avenue for reducing dissonance, which is bolstering identity, I think this is to be continued. I've not seen any research where people have really looked at ways that people might bolster their identity and therefore overcome any of this sort of notion that they may be tarnished by engaging in morally questionable behaviour to the extent that they think that is. But perhaps research around self-affirmation and other avenues of bolstering identity could be quite interesting here. But again, I'm not aware of any, but it is, I think, an avenue in which we're likely to see some sort of, I suppose, dissonance resolution by bolstering the sense that we're good people, thinking that we're good people, and therefore the fact that we do engage in this behaviour is perhaps therefore somewhat justified. And of course, we do see this in other domains. We have seen these sorts of processes in how people think about ethical and unethical conduct in the domain of how they treat humans as well. So just to come back to this, what is the spreading of alternatives? And again, so here we've got this model where we're finding that, the people experience discomfort, and they wanted to resolve that discomfort, often in favour of continuing the behaviour, continuing their meat-eating behaviour and their commitment to it. And so what is this idea of spreading of alternatives? Well, it's drawn from the action-based model of dissonance. And again, this is this idea that that really the reason that we resolve dissonance, and cognitive dissonance, again, is a very well-known psychological construct or process, but the idea is that actually we resolve dissonance because we want to be able to act in the world. And it's very hard to act in the world if we are, I guess, caught up in binds in terms of worrying about what we should be doing and the conflicts around that. So in a sense, if I make a difficult decision and I want to act on it, then I need to commit to that decision and psychologically rule out the alternative. And if I don't do that, then I might remain conflicted. So to commit to an action and commit to a behavior, I need to spread the alternative and see the alternative as less likely, less feasible, less desirable. And I think we do see this, and certainly we know that throughout history, vegetarians have been characterized as domineering, secretly sadistic, pacifists, hypochondriacs, drug users, weight-conscious, feminine, and liberal. So there's certainly been prejudice targeted at vegetarians for a very long time, and I think you might even see elements of that in meat eaters, particularly. I think vegetarians and vegans can actually themselves, by their very kind of choice, represent a bit of a conflict or a challenge to meat eaters. And again, we might see that there is this subtle tendency to derogate that behaviour or even that individual as a way of spreading that alternative, as seeing it as less likely, and therefore enabling me to commit to that action, which is to eat meat, without feeling troubled by it. And so I think it's really important to look at this process, because it probably is quite informative in terms of how we might construct interventions. And so if you think about the idea that, and again, a lot of campaigns at the moment around meat eating can be focused a lot on the harm. They can be quite explicit. And of course, part of that is to say, hey, look, your current behavior is inconsistent with your moral self-concept. You think you're a good person, but look at what you're doing. Look at the harm that you're causing. And of course, this is where the dissonance is created. And there are two options to resolve that dissonance, as we suggested earlier. One is to commit to change. So I accept that harm, I take responsibility, and I acknowledge the consequences. And in doing so, I stop eating meat. I become a vegetarian myself. And of course, at that point, I no longer experience dissonance. But of course, if I choose not to do that, and as I said, many people do choose not to do that, then what am I going to do to reduce that dissonance? Well, I'm going to commit to my behaviour more, because I'm going to see that idea of change as a less viable alternative. I'm going to spread those alternatives, and I'm going to deny harm. I'm going to deny responsibility and refuse to see the consequences of my behaviour. And I think one of the things we've got to be wary of here is this idea that when we're intervening in ethically relevant contexts, that we do have to tread carefully, because if we go in there with a strong message, we may just as easily end up whoops, there we are. Got my video back now. We may just as easily end up leading people to become more committed to the action that we're trying to change. So I think this is really important to think through, and I think dissonance and that model of the spreading alternatives and the action-based model of dissonance is quite useful for thinking through some of those issues. As I said before, people don't resolve dissonance each and every time that they engage in the act of meat eating. And so I think that, the fact that we develop habits is one way in which we often don't have to resolve this dissonance. And so, often because, perhaps because we do rule out the alternative, and often through the dissonance reduction process, by committing to the behavior and also seeing the alternative as not a viable option, it reduces our sense of reflection or perceived choice. And of course, this is what may lead to the development of habits. And we know that these sorts of processes do lead to habits. And of course, habitual behavior is often carried out without conscious reflection, meaning I don't experience dissonance when I engage in that habitual behavior. Also, habitual behaviors are quite likely to spread through populations, again, because that high frequency and the low reflection around meat eating sends a message to others that there's no moral conflict here. I don't experience this. And of course, this then makes meat eating and the lack of conflict around meat eating appear normative, and again, reduces the opportunity for conscious reflection more broadly, because people are seeing that this is just something that we normally do. I don't need to reflect on it or ask questions about it. It's just what we do. It's the way we do it. And of course, we might people who do experience or engage in meat eating might actually more I suppose intentionally defend their own behaviour. And in order to reduce dissonance, we might also aim to recruit others, either directly or indirectly. I guess making arguments as to why it's okay and there's no problem, and that this is again some of the arguments that I've outlined there. It's natural, normal, it's necessary, for example. So I think we can sort of see that that norms can quickly develop around these behaviours, and again particularly around habitual behaviours. And of course, institutions protect us from dissonance as well. So we might ritualise meat eating. For example, we eat lamb on Australia Day. Now eating lamb is more an act of in-group love than it is about harm. And so institutions and rituals can protect us from worrying about the harm that we might be causing. And of course, factory farms are carefully kept out of sight. So we often try to sanitize the process, not let people make the link between the meat they're buying and the animal it's come from. And of course, we can see even links here between perhaps how, for example, in Australia, we've treated asylum seekers and how we put them in detention in places we don't often see, and also laws around reporting on those as well. So we often do try and keep uncomfortable things out of sight, things that might cause dissonance, and make us reflect on perhaps those ethical dimensions of what we're doing. And I guess these are just ways in which we might outsource the meat paradox or ethical conflict more broadly. And I think this analysis is useful for thinking through how we might outsource ethical conflicts in other domains as well. So what are some of I just want to, I guess, step away from the meat paradox specifically now and just think about, what are some of the broader benefits of raising moral awareness about meat as a resource and perhaps around resources more generally. So meat is a resource, and one of the things that we often think about resources in models of cooperation. So how do people share resources? And again, when we look at these models, we largely focus on how resources are spread between users or players. Again, we use economic games often to understand how people share resources, how people cooperate around resource sharing. And so, again, our main focus in those sorts of studies is to think about what are the kinds of things that might lead people to cooperate and share resources in a more fair, a more equitable way between different players or different users of that resource, and develop models of understanding that, and what are the factors that might undermine cooperation and trust, what are the factors that might bolster it. But one of the questions that I think that hasn't been answered or asked quite so often is, what happens when people actually view the resource differently? Now, often when we are modeling the way that people share and cooperate around the use of resources, we're often using quite fungible things like tokens or money or points. And these are, I suppose, modeling the value of resources, but we're often not looking at, well, what other kinds of value do resources have attached to them? And what if a resource does actually have some moral value attached to it? That is, not in terms of its ability to satisfy the needs of players in the game, but actually, how does it actually, whether that resource itself is viewed through a moral lens. And so we tried to model this by using a basic resource dilemma game. And again, these games look something like this, where people will come in groups. In our study, there were groups of 6, and they play a resource game over about 20 rounds, where they get to choose or take a number of points for themselves from between 0 to 30, from a total of about 3,000 points. And they're told that the pool will replenish at a rate of about 1%. So if they all take too much, eventually the pool will become depleted, as in often happens in this model, I suppose, the way that resources become depleted. And if they all take too much, that resource will become depleted, and the game will finish. If they all take a little less for each of them, everyone takes a little less, in the long run, people actually all do better. And of course, that resource will be more evenly and distributed. So how do we, these are games are really trying to understand what are the factors that lead people to cooperate and therefore take fewer resources or points for themselves, ensuring that the pool is not depleted and then enabling more people to use that pool. And hopefully that's explained to you broadly what these resource games are. But as I said, often what hasn't been factored in is whether or not people how people think about the resource beyond just its value to the players in the game. And so in this study, we had people play this game, but we showed half of those people in groups of 6. We took 3 of them individually into a cubicle near where they were each playing the game. And again, they weren't actually playing the game. It wasn't a real game. They were given bogus feedback. But we wanted half of them to see this setup that we had. And so we had this coffee grinder there, and we had a tube going into it. And on the right, we had this plastic container, which was from the biology department. It was full of crickets. And we showed people that if you press that button on the screen on the computer, which was connected to the coffee grinder, that grinder would turn on. It made a god-awful noise. And people were told, look, when the resource pool is depleted, this activates this computer, which turns on that coffee grinder. And in those test tubes, you can see down the left there, people could see that there were some crickets in there. And we said, we're going to put the crickets into the top there. And if that coffee grinder turns on, these crickets won't live. Now, of course, crickets are minimally morally relevant for most people. They're insects, and often we kill insects if they're annoying for us. But of course, thinking about this was rather grisly for most people. They didn't like the idea that there were going to be crickets in the coffee grinder. Of course, there weren't any crickets in the coffee grinder. We never harmed any crickets in this study, but people did believe that they were going to be in there, and therefore, as they were playing the game, they had in the back of their mind that if this resource gets depleted, there is some harm that's going to happen to these crickets, which in some ways are minimally morally relevant. And of course, perhaps not so surprisingly, you can see that in the experimental condition, people were more cooperative. They were less likely to take more points for themselves. You can see on rounds 10 and 15 where they got the message that the resource pool was being depleted. We gave them, again, a bogus message telling them that it was close to being depleted. Everybody changed their behaviour, but again, in a stepped way, people who were concerned about the crickets were just consistently less likely to take more for themselves. So I think one of the things here, whilst it was a sort of, I think, somewhat of a strong paradigm, the point that we're trying to make is that really, when we do attach a different kind of value to the resource, one in which makes people concerned for the welfare of the resource itself and not just whether or not it's being shared equally among the players, cooperation is actually increased. And so this is an important avenue to increasing cooperation. I won't go through the details here, but just simply to say that, when we introduced a defector and people were shown through the feedback on their screens that there was someone, again, this was bogus feedback, but they believed there was someone who kept taking the maximum number of points. In other words, they were defecting, they weren't cooperating. We can see that, again, people were less cooperative in this, and we know when there are defectors, cooperation is diminished. But we did see that there was this difference still, and where people were concerned for the resource itself, at least in terms of not wanting it to be depleted because of the crickets, we actually see a contributor to human cooperation, which I think is sometimes something which hasn't been modelled so directly into these games around resource use and cooperation. So just very in summary of this, I guess this point, and I just have a couple more things to say beyond this. I think the meat paradox is getting stronger. You know, our need for resources is increasing and resources themselves are becoming more scarce, yet we are also becoming more sensitive, probably mostly in the well-to-do parts of the world where we can afford to be sensitive to others more broadly. I think, you know, when we're struggling for, you know, feeding our own families, we're probably less sensitive to the rights and needs of animals. But certainly in the first world and where we are economically advantaged, we are becoming more sensitive to the rights and needs of many resources, including the non-human contenders for those resources. In a sense, this is kind of creating what could be seen as a moral bottleneck or a pressure point where the rights and needs of humans, my need for food or for resources is coming into conflict with my consideration and concern for the rights and needs of non-humans. And I think that this is, an interesting kind of point to be looking at in terms of how people are resolving this and how people are dealing with that bottleneck or that moral bottleneck, if you like. But I think it also has some implications for how we understand prejudice. And often prejudice has been thought to be leveraged from a sense of threat or a desire to avoid or to feel fear from other groups or other things. But I think also this work really taps into this idea that the prejudice can be leveraged from appetitive and approach motivated factors. You know, when we want to use something, when we want to engage in something for our personal needs, prejudice also becomes a part of how we achieve that. And of course, we can see this in work on objectification, and we know that often objectification happens in contexts where people are seeking sexual pleasure, often using others for sex as a way of satisfying our needs, and objectifying them in the process allows us to satisfy those needs without sometimes being concerned for their own, I suppose, perspective on that. And maybe also other instrumental motivations like cheap labor and the dehumanization that may be associated with our use of cheap labor. Again, it meets our needs, it allows us to get what we need, but we might engage in prejudice in order to be able to facilitate that. And I think these, again, are sort of appetitive and approach motivated factors. And this is perhaps a way of understanding the motivations underlying prejudice that throws a different light on the way that we've often thought about it, which is more about threat and avoidance. Just before I finish, I just want to quickly touch on some other work that's going on in my lab. Two of my PhD students, Christopher Klebel and also Ji Song. The work by Christopher has been on beauty. And again, we've been looking at, and this is funded by the National Geographic, we've been looking at beauty as I guess a consequential or an important dimension in understanding how people think about the moral standing of animals. And here in this work, again, this is currently under review. We've looked at how this might compare to other factors that we know contribute to moral standing, such as the perceived agency and patiency. Now, these are both things which relate to how much mind an animal might possess, and other work by Jared Piazza again and Jeff Goodwin has shown that perceived harmfulness is a negative predictor of moral standing in animals. If we think that animals can be harmful, we change our perception of their moral worth. But we've looked beyond those factors and controlling for them. We've also found independently that when people see animals as beautiful, they attribute more moral standing to those animals than animals which are seen as non-beautiful. And again, I think that this is important work because it's starting to identify that beyond mind, beyond sentience, beyond those sorts of things that we know have for a long time have been important in terms of our moral reasoning, perhaps there are other things such as quality, such as beauty, and there no doubt are other qualities too that do lead or at least elicit some kind of signature of moral concern and I guess moral consideration. And I think this is really important if we're going to think about how to perhaps elicit the way people think about resources and perhaps deal with environmental issues as well. And perhaps there are ways in which we can leverage some moral consideration for the environment, even when those entities, those environmental entities, don't have sentience, they don't think, they don't feel. And interestingly, we've also found in this work that it's not only for animals, but for people, for landscapes, and also for buildings. That the beautiful entities are seen, people express a greater desire to protect them, and also using measures of moral standing. They attribute more moral standing to those entities. And this seems to be explained in part by seeing those entities as also higher in purity. And again, we know that from work on moral foundations theory that purity is an intuitive element of people's moral judgment. And so it may be that beauty and purity, and we do know there's a strong overlap there, maybe beauty triggers or draws in this concern for purity, and this in turn maybe what helps to explain why people want to protect or why they afford moral standing to beautiful things. We've also been examining how awe might increase, I suppose, lead to an expansion in people's moral worlds. And in this work, we've been using virtual reality and letting people, there's some work on the overview effect. Broadly, we've been using videos and images and having people engage in a 3D environment where they feel immersed in this rather awe-inducing experience. And then we provided them with this measure of moral expansiveness, which again is some work that I've done with Charlie Crimston. And here we can see that in this measure, people are asked to indicate how much moral obligation they feel towards these different entities. And so people tend to put entities in this order, all the way from family and friends and in-group, different, revered groups, and all the human groups kind of make it into the center there. But then we end up with, animals and environment and plants and even objects are a little further out. But people do express, and we can see how expansive a person's moral world is according to where they place these things in those circles, and how central they are, how I suppose how many of those things come in closer into the center. And so this measure allows us to, I suppose, assess people's moral expansiveness. And what we're finding is that awe does appear to lead to an increase in moral expansiveness. And this appears to happen via the small self. And we know from work on awe that people tend to feel small. They tend to experience themselves in this diminished but also vastness kind of way. And through this, this allows, it would seem, through this process, for people to become more morally expansive, to spread that consideration they have, that obligation they have to a greater number of entities in the world around them. So there are these, I suppose, both beauty and awe seem to be pathways through which we can expand our moral world. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much. There's my email if you want to get in touch on the website, and I'll jump off, stop sharing, and be happy to respond to any questions that anyone has.
Well, thank you very much. That was a lot of really fascinating work that you were describing, and we have a few questions so far. Some of them came in closer to the end, so I decided to just wait until the end. And let's see. So Hannah asked us if, thinking about, you mentioned prejudice towards vegetarians, but also prejudice towards meat eaters, and it does seem to go both ways. Hannah says that, the meat occasionally, a meat minimalist, but sometimes vegetarians make me feel like a monster or barbarian without empathy. And so also intersecting, Hannah says she's female, and there's also a tendency for some men to view vegetarian women as being more feminine and morally pure, which again can make someone who eats meat feel awful about practices that may reflect their own culture or socioeconomic class. In the US, eating meat can sometimes represent affordable survival for people who can't afford a wide array of vegetables that are needed for a healthy vegetarian diet. So the prejudice against meat eaters question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think that that's solving the meat paradox, obviously, and that's what I was interested in trying to understand, is that particular process. But absolutely, I think that there is people are viewing meat eating as I suppose a moral, increasing that, viewing it through an ethical lens, and to that extent, you may call that prejudice towards meat eaters. full disclosure, I'm not vegetarian. So, I experience discomfort every time I do this research. So I don't think that certainly not the point of the research here is not to drive prejudice towards meat eaters. It is to try and understand how we engage in the resolution of discomfort. But I do take the point. I think it's probably outside of the processes that I'm talking about here, because I'm not sure that prejudice towards meat eaters, I think, justifies anything for vegetarians or for vegans. It probably is more about a moral stand that they're taking. I guess it might reinforce the sense that they are right in their moral stand. I guess that might be the case. Yeah.
Great. So Melody asks the role of fictional media and depictions of animals, and to explore some of these conflicts. She mentions the movie Okja was on Netflix, and how media depictions might impact opinions regarding these issues in the meat paradox. Are fictional works able to access and alter some of these moral views more so than explicit interpersonal conversations that sometimes bring in like questions of prejudice and stereotypes?
Yeah, I mean the short answer to that is I don't know. The longer answer is I think that any time, and I think this is just true in general. I don't think this is true about just meat eating. I think it's true about how to address ethically relevant behaviour and trying to change behaviour in that domain. I think we have to tread carefully. Again, think about those backfire effects. I think that much of the advocacy has gone in very hard, and I'm not sure that it might be having the desired effect always. It certainly might be tipping people who are close to the edge across. But anyone who's not close to the edge in terms of changing behaviour are probably going to go the other way on it. So finding indirect routes where people can perhaps experience. I mean, one of the fascinating things in Australia that happened was we became aware that the slaughter of cows in Indonesia was somewhat less sanitised than the way that we would like to think that it happened here. Of course, we don't think about it happening here very much, but certainly it seemed a lot worse in the way that cows are being. Of course, we have live exports going to Indonesia. So what anecdotally, and I don't have evidence on this, but anecdotally that event where people became outraged at the Indonesians and how they were treating Australian cows was perhaps more effective in driving people to change their behaviour than was, I suppose, a direct attack on people themselves. And a focus on their own behaviour. In a sense, it allowed people to engage with the ethical dimension of what the problem, what they're experiencing was, without feeling personally threatened in the process. And I think that perhaps that may be relevant to that, that comment, where if we can find ways to get people to think about these issues and at least reflect on the ethical component of it, and therefore to make more informed decisions, I think helping people to be able to see that ethical dimension without feeling threatened by it is where we need to be looking and how we need to go about it. And again, even one way there is to focus on perhaps reducitarianism, allowing people to focus on, well, could I make small step changes in this domain, and would that be overall a better way to perhaps get people to start to make, you might achieve more change in more people that way than with some of the more direct approaches.
So building off that question and that response, there's another question that rolled in from Pratima. It's basically, if you expose meat eaters to climate change and other environmental issues due to animal agriculture, health issues, and so forth, might that affect their feeling toward eating meat? And it seems like rather than directly confronting the meat eating itself. Yeah,
I think that's interesting. I came across another one, which, I think we all have come across another one actually, which is which really, the idea of zoonosis, and that again, pandemics may be in fact bred through the way that we raise cattle in mass factory farms for meat production. And so, I do, look, humans are naturally, we're naturally quite selfish in some ways. Of course, it's interesting, we're trying to find ways to build empathy, but also if we can find ways to target those selfish motives, sometimes that is a good avenue and gets around some of the problems. And so if people are focused on some of these other issues, and start to think about, well, maybe I need to change for those reasons. It would avoid that conflict. Now, but I don't, having said that, I do think that putting a moral frame around these issues, and of course, we're looking at how can you put a moral frame around nature, using things like beauty and other avenues. I do think it's really important that we do this. I do think that ethics and morality are very, very important, and developing empathy, building empathy is a very important avenue to get people to care about stuff. So we do need to use it, but perhaps use it carefully, and perhaps these are some other avenues that can contribute to that in ways that make it a little less directly threatening for people.
And I'm reminded of various arguments for not eating meat, that some of which they do bring in both moralized arguments, but also simply pragmatic arguments about reducing climate change concern. So it does seem like you're suggesting a mix of motives is relevant to orchestrate together.
Yeah, I think so. And again, I think that I think a lot of people used to be vegetarian for health reasons, and I think a lot more people now are vegetarian for ethical reasons. So there has been, again, I think an important shift, and I think that shift is actually having an impact on people's choices and the way they're thinking about it. So, I don't think we should throw it out, but I do think we have to be careful with it. Yeah.
And so we have a number of questions popping through. I'm going to try to organize them thematically. One that rolled in, it's a follow-up to this particular thread by Sean. He asks whether, with climate change, is focusing on issues like climate change and the role of meat eating, would it raise perception of mind in animals? So by appealing to the non-direct impacts of, let's say, factory farming on climate change, would it incidentally increase mind perception, do you think?
I don't know. What I do know, I think that there's only anecdotal evidence for this, but when people make a choice to stop eating meat for health reasons, perhaps, they do tend to find it easier to engage with the ethical dimensions of I suppose thinking through those issues once they've made the behavioural change. I guess there's no conflict there, and they can actually more openly engage with that ethical dimension. So if people do make behaviour change for other reasons, the ethical dimension comes back in quite easily for them. Whether or not focusing on those other issues might lead to a change in how people see animals, I don't know. I think it would have to be a little more direct than that, perhaps, to really have that sort of impact. But yeah, I think it's certainly worth thinking through and exploring.
Great. So there's some other questions that are targeting other aspects of that are engaging with other aspects of your talk. One from Julian, who you talked with earlier. So really interesting work. He says, any thoughts on whether this prevention of harm to animals for meat consumption is sort of dichotomous and all or nothing, consume meat or not, or do you instead see people preferring to go to the choice of preventing as much harm to animals when needing to consume for meat rather than stopping altogether? And do they see that as good enough? He's thinking of some parts of, he says he's thinking of some parts of Hinduism and other religious practices like halal cuisine. Second, he wonders how much of that may be informed by a hedonic desire to keep consuming meat, or even to avoid exclusion by other meat eaters too.
Yeah, the first part of the question, I think, goes to this notion of reducitarianism, which is, I think, getting a bit of traction. Where, perhaps what we should be pushing is, look, what we need to, I think that the argument is quite clear. We do need to reduce the amount of meat consumption we're engaging in globally. Whether that means we all need to be vegetarians, or whether it just means we all need to significantly reduce our meat consumption. As I said before, I think, looking at the reduction avenue may be a way of getting people on board without getting them offside. And so in that sense, if you can create more change and therefore address these problems more better, then that's a good way to go. Yeah, so I forgot the second part of that, but
the second part really had to do with the role of hedonic appetite,
oh, yes.
and also potential social rewards / exclusion costs as people navigate some of these conflicts?
Yeah, well, I think absolutely. I think again, if yeah, it's just an easier change to make, isn't it? And of course, the hedonic reward and potential exclusion from, you know, I mean, one of the biggest things is, yeah, I mean, what do you do when you invited around for a barbecue? You know, it's a lot easier if you could eat the sausage, I suppose, but then not eat sausages the rest of the week at home or something like that. So I suppose it does make it easier in that sense for people. But then again, some people prefer to take the strong stand on it, and I don't, you know, I'm certainly not suggesting that's a problem to do that, but it would be easier, I suppose, on people if they found that conflict there yeah. So certainly hedonic and inclusion motives would be satisfied in that kind of change. Yeah.
So that's good. There's a couple of last questions here. One from Kyle. He asks, for the graph showing a negative correlation between ratings of species edibility and attribution of mind, he points out the variation across cultures in which animals are considered normal to eat food. And whether he wants to know whether your research has looked at cultural differences and, moreover, ability to relate to particular species, being evolutionary close relatives, having kept them as pets and so forth. Does that change the attribution of mind? So cultural variation, but also relational variation.
Yeah. Look, I'm not going to be able to pull to mind any particular research on that, but there is definitely cultural variation, and there are studies looking at that. So yes, absolutely. I mean, you know, just the very fact that, you know, cows are protected in India but eaten everywhere else in the world. So there is absolutely cultural variation. And yeah, I mean, our relationship, and I think that's the big point, actually. The way that we think about animals largely comes down to how we relate, what our relationship is with them. In other words, what they mean to us. So if pets are sources of social connection, yeah, of course, we're not going to like to eat them, and we're going to attribute them with mind, probably in order to connect with them in a sort of anthropomorphized way. And of course, if animals are used in some sort of way to satisfy our needs, then we'll see them in a way which enables that. So, you know, I do think that we're pretty, our perceptions of animals, because we don't really know what really, you know, I mean, what is the mental life of a prawn? I've got absolutely no idea. It could be quite complex, but we don't really know. We think it's probably not. But again, we have no real obvious evidence for that. Perhaps some, but you know, again, we wouldn't know what it's like, and so there's a lot of leeway there to decide how we think about animal minds, and I suppose that means that leeway, that flexibility is going to be probably determined by our own motives, perspectives, needs, etc.
Great, that's interesting. And interestingly, Pratima chimed in with more of a comment, but as a side note, India, she says India is one of the leading leather suppliers. People don't eat cows, but still kill them for leather.
There you go.
She notes that she's.
I didn't know that.
But one more question I see here from Catherine. So from your model, how might the four ends affect delineations of eating appropriate animals and those, so eating appropriate animals and those that are not? Are mind, beauty, or awe-inspiring, or the inspiration of awe, the primary mechanisms of separating eatable animals from non-eatable? She's thinking of eating horses, which is normal in some societies and illegal, in addition to not nice, not necessary, and so forth in other societies.
Look, I think probably the best way for me to answer is I think these are sort of separate factors. So the justification, the kind of the four ends type approach is really, you know, it's about thinking about my own behavior and finding ways to normalize that or to see it as necessary. So really the justifications there are really focused on me and my actions and why I need to do it. Whereas those other factors that you mentioned are really more about the qualities or attributes of the animal. And I suppose in that way, you know, certainly I'm going to be able to appreciate those qualities more if I'm not engaging in the justifications. The justifications will, by virtue of, you know, probably lead me to see those animals as less deserving, having fewer of those qualities because I want to use them in a particular kind of way. But they are kind of different things, I guess, because one's really focused on my behavior and and the other is more about the entity itself. But yeah, certainly both are playing together in that space. Yeah.
So we don't have any other questions at the moment. So I suppose in closing, I think one of the interesting things about your work is that you're revealing both intrapersonal factors that people are navigating, the different costs and benefits, but also an intersection with some of the affordances of different cultural norms, different societal norms, infrastructural considerations. I mean, I guess moving forward, how do you see your work sort of navigating this? It seems like a complex person by situation interaction. And I'm curious if you have any other thoughts about it, especially if the meat paradox is increasing, whether you see more focus on these intra-individual dissonance trade-offs versus more consideration of how people interact with these different social scaffolds and environments they interact with.
Yeah, I think I mean, in terms of my research, in some ways, I suppose we're now pushing in some other directions a little bit, but certainly there's a lot of research going on this at the moment. It's quite it's a field that people are starting to really step into, because I think it's something that we've realised at the issue, at the level of a social issue, is something we need to start to think about and understand. And again, psychology has a lot to offer in that space. So, I certainly, I think it's easier to sometimes just look at the individual level factors, but, we do need to start to think about how those broader factors are playing into it. I don't think there's a lot of research covering that at the moment, although we can certainly theorize from that perspective. Maybe it's hard to actually do empirical work on some of those factors, but certainly around norms and things like that. I mean, we've always known that's a very, very important determinant of behaviour. So it's, again, some of that stuff has been shown in other domains, but hopefully we can use some of the knowledge we already have, and also some of the stuff that we developed specifically in this context to I guess, start to address what does appear to be an issue we need to kind of focus on, which is, at the very least, a significant reduction in our consumption of meat, and how we also think about resources and treat resources in the world in a way which is perhaps more using our knowledge of human ethics and ethical decision making and consideration to understand how to I suppose get people to engage in a more conservative or conservationist, I should say, approach to the world around them too, because that's obviously an impending issue that we're facing into as well.
Well, this has been very illuminating. Really appreciate you taking time out of your morning to come visit us. I know
No
it's
problem.
technically tomorrow there.
It is tomorrow here.
I do appreciate it. Thank you all the attendees for really interesting questions. Again, thank you. I think this has been a great extension of the series and thinking about how we expand empathy across different species boundaries. And again, if you have any questions for Dr. Bastian with his website, the recording will be up online later this week. And I just want to thank again David Price, our producer, for helping out today and organizing this. And thank you again, Dr. Bastian, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.